The first sign that something was terribly wrong wasn't the sound of engines or the dust hanging in the air, it was the silence. A strange, hollow quiet where something familiar should have been. When the homeowner pulled into the driveway after a long day of work, the world fell off, as if a piece of reality had been erased. The fence that had stood for years, solid, protective, defining the boundary between safety and the outside world, was simply gone. No warning. No note. No explanation. Just churned earth, broken wood, and the unmistakable marks of heavy machinery, as if someone had reached into a life and ripped a part of it away without permission. Before the shock fully settles in, let me ask you something. From which beautiful country are you watching this story today? Whether you're in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in this wide world, if you love your country, take a moment to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to comment your country's name below. Let's see which nation rises to the top as this story unfolds. The fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was history. It marked the edge of a dream that began years earlier, when this house was nothing more than a risky investment and a hopeful plan. That fence had been built with care, measured twice, paid for with hard-earned money, and approved through the proper channels, or so it was believed. It stood through storms, neighborhood changes, and quiet evenings where it offered privacy and peace. And now, in a single workday, it had been reduced to debris. Confusion turned into disbelief, and disbelief slowly hardened into a cold knot of anger. There had been no emails, no certified letters, no warning signs posted on the property. The homeowner stood there, staring at the open yard, feeling exposed in a way that went far beyond missing property. It felt like a violation. Like someone had crossed an invisible line and dared the consequences. The Homeowners Association was no stranger to controversy. It was known in the neighborhood as strict, inflexible, and often overreaching. Rules were enforced with precision when it suited them, and ignored when it didn't. Lawns were measured, paint colors scrutinized, and trash cans monitored like clockwork. But demolition? That was something else entirely. This wasn't a fine slipped into a mailbox or a warning posted online. This was force. As the initial shock wore off, questions began flooding in. Who authorized this? On what grounds? And how could something so drastic happen without a single attempt at communication? The absence of answers made the situation feel even darker, as if the silence itself was part of the strategy. The homeowner walked the length of the destroyed boundary, noticing deep tire tracks cutting into the soil. This wasn't a rush mistake. This was deliberate. Heavy equipment had been brought in. Time had been spent. Decisions had been made. Somewhere, paperwork may have been signed, hands shaken, and plans approved, all without the one person who mattered most being involved. Memories surfaced of past HOA notices that felt overly aggressive, of neighbors quietly complaining but never pushing back, afraid of fines or retaliation. The association thrived on that fear, on the idea that resistance was more trouble than it was worth. And for years that system worked. Until now. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the open yard, the sense of vulnerability deepened. Without the fence, the property felt unfinished, unprotected. Cars passed by more slowly than usual. Curious glances lingered. It was a reminder that boundaries, once removed, change how the world looks at you, and how safe you feel within your own space. The homeowner didn't sleep much that night. Thoughts raced, replaying every interaction with the HOA, every form ever submitted, every approval email saved somewhere deep in an inbox. There had to be proof. There had to be something that showed this fence was legitimate, approved, and lawful. Because if it was, then what happened wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Morning brought determination. The kind that settles in quietly but firmly, replacing shock with purpose. This wasn't going to be ignored. This wasn't going to be brushed off with excuses or buried under bureaucracy. Phone calls were made. Records were pulled. Old documents were searched for like buried treasure. And slowly, pieces began to surface. The fence had been approved years ago under a previous HOA board. Regulations had since changed, but approvals weren't supposed to vanish with new leadership. That was the rule. That was the law. Yet somehow, the current board acted as if none of that mattered, as if history could be bulldozed along with wood and soil. As the truth began to take shape, another realization emerged. This wasn't just about one fence. This was about power. About control. About what happens when an authority assumes no one will fight back. The HOA didn't expect resistance. They didn't expect documentation. And they certainly didn't expect what was coming next. By the end of the day, the homeowner stood once again at the edge of the destroyed property line, no longer in disbelief, but in resolve. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far bigger, something that would ripple through the neighborhood, shake the HOA's confidence, and force accountability where none had existed before. And as the dust from the demolished fence finally settled, a new storm was quietly gathering, one that the HOA had no idea they had unleashed. The anger didn't arrive all at once. It grew slowly, fed by every unanswered email, every vague response, every carefully worded message that avoided responsibility. What began as shock had now evolved into something sharper, more focused. The homeowner realized that outrage alone wouldn't be enough. This situation demanded precision, patience, and proof. The search began in old digital folders and dusty filing cabinets, places long forgotten but never erased. Contracts, permits, approval letters, HOA guidelines from previous years, all of it was carefully reviewed, page by page, line by line. Each document felt like a piece of a puzzle the HOA hoped no one would ever bother to assemble. But the picture was becoming clearer with every passing hour. Buried deep in the records was the approval. Official. Signed. Dated. A confirmation that the fence had been reviewed and accepted under the rules in effect at the time. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't conditional. It was valid. That single document changed everything. The fence hadn't been illegal. It hadn't violated regulations. And most importantly, it hadn't been subject to removal without due process. Armed with this knowledge, the homeowner reached out to the HOA, this time not with confusion, but with clarity. Emails were sent calmly, professionally, outlining the facts without emotion. The approval was attached. The timeline was explained. A simple question was asked: on what authority was the fence destroyed? The response didn't come immediately. When it did, it was cold, brief, and evasive. The HOA claimed the fence violated current standards and posed a community concern. There was no acknowledgement of the prior approval, no explanation for the lack of notice, and no apology for the destruction of private property. It read less like a resolution and more like a warning. That was when something subtle shifted. The homeowner recognized the tactic. This wasn't about rules, it was about intimidation. The HOA expected compliance, not conversation. They assumed the cost, time, and stress of fighting back would be enough to silence any protest. And for most people, it would have been. But this time, they had misjudged. Neighbors began to notice the absence of the fence, and curiosity turned into quiet concern. Some stopped to look. Others asked questions. A few shared their own stories, fines that felt unfair, notices that seemed arbitrary, decisions that made no sense. Whispers spread, cautious and hushed, as if the HOA itself might be listening. The homeowner listened carefully. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. Late nights were spent researching local property laws and HOA limitations. Court cases surfaced, stories of associations that overstepped and paid the price. It became clear that HOAs were powerful, but not untouchable. Their authority had boundaries, just like the fence they had erased. Then came the letters. Official-looking envelopes arrived, stamped and formal, warning of potential fines for non-compliance. The irony was impossible to ignore. The fence was gone, yet the threats remained. Each letter felt like pressure, a calculated attempt to overwhelm and exhaust. But instead of fear, they sparked something else: resolve. The homeowner began documenting everything. Dates. Times. Emails. Photos of the demolished fence, tire tracks, property damage. Copies were stored digitally and physically, backed up and organized. What felt excessive at first soon felt necessary. Because when power is challenged, narratives matter. A consultation with a legal professional confirmed what instinct already knew. The HOA had crossed a line. Destruction of property without notice or legal authority wasn't just unethical, it was actionable. Suddenly, the situation expanded beyond inconvenience. It had entered the realm of consequence. Yet the HOA remained silent on one crucial point: accountability. Weeks passed, and the empty boundary became a constant reminder. Rain washed over the exposed ground. Strangers' eyes wandered freely across what had once been private. The sense of violation lingered, not just physically, but emotionally. Home no longer felt fully like home. Still, something unexpected happened. Support began to grow. A neighbor left a note expressing disbelief at what had happened. Another shared archived HOA documents that had mysteriously disappeared from the online portal. Someone else mentioned a board member with a history of personal grudges and unilateral decisions. Slowly, the homeowner realized this fight was no longer solitary. But resistance has a cost. The HOA escalated its tone. More letters. More warnings. Vague references to legal action that never quite materialized. It was pressure without substance, meant to intimidate rather than resolve. And in that pressure, their fear began to show. Because if the homeowner backed down, the story would end quietly. But if they didn't, it would become public. And that was the HOA's greatest weakness. One evening, standing at the edge of the property as the sun dipped low, the homeowner imagined what the fence once looked like, and what it could become again. Not just rebuilt, but stronger. Permanent. Impossible to ignore or erase. That thought lingered. The decision was made. This would not end with silence or compromise. It would end with accountability. And if the HOA wanted a battle of endurance, they had chosen the wrong opponent. As legal documents were prepared and evidence carefully compiled, a final realization settled in. The HOA hadn't just destroyed a fence. They had awakened a challenge they were completely unprepared to face. And soon, the question would no longer be whether the fence would return, but how much the HOA would be forced to pay for tearing it down. The moment the complaint was filed, everything changed. What had once lived quietly behind closed doors, emails, warnings, and thinly veiled threats, was now part of a public record. The homeowner didn't announce it. There was no dramatic declaration, no confrontation in the street. Just paperwork, submitted calmly, confidently, and with a certainty that came from knowing the truth was finally standing on solid ground. The HOA, however, felt it immediately. Their responses grew faster, sharper, and less composed. Messages that once took weeks now arrived within days. The language shifted subtly, trading authority for defensiveness. Words like misunderstanding and procedural oversight began to replace earlier accusations. It was the first crack in the facade, and it showed just how fragile their confidence really was. The neighborhood felt different now. Conversations that once ended abruptly when HOA members walked by began to stretch longer. People lingered on sidewalks. Curious glances were exchanged. The demolished fence had become more than a missing structure, it was a symbol. A reminder of how quickly power could be abused, and how rare it was for someone to push back. Online, the story began to spread. A brief post appeared on a local community forum, written carefully and without exaggeration. It laid out the facts plainly. No emotional language, no accusations beyond what could be proven. Photos were included. Documents blurred for privacy, but clear enough to show approvals and timelines. The response was immediate. Support poured in from unexpected places. Homeowners shared similar experiences, some recent, others buried under years of resignation. Many admitted they had wanted to challenge the HOA but were too afraid of fines, legal costs, or retaliation. Seeing someone finally stand their ground changed something. Fear started to loosen its grip. The HOA noticed. A sudden, Community update. Email was sent to all residents, addressing ongoing concerns and reminding everyone of the importance of cooperation and mutual respect. It spoke broadly, saying nothing and everything at once. To those unaware, it sounded routine. To those watching closely, it sounded like panic. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. The homeowner was advised to prepare, not just legally, but emotionally. Challenges like this rarely ended quickly. HOAs relied on exhaustion, on the hope that persistence would wear down resistance. But preparation turned waiting into strategy. Every move was anticipated. Every delay documented. Then came the meeting announcement. An emergency HOA board session was scheduled, open to residents. The agenda was vague, but everyone knew what it was really about. The fence. The complaint. The exposure. The homeowner attended quietly, sitting among neighbors whose expressions revealed a mixture of curiosity and restrained satisfaction. The board members appeared tense, their posture stiff. Their authority, once unquestioned, now felt rehearsed. As reports were read and motions discussed, the absence of transparency became glaring. Questions from residents were deflected. Requests for clarification were postponed. The structure of control was still there, but it was wobbling. Outside that meeting room, something remarkable was happening. Trust in the HOA was eroding. Residents talked afterward in clusters, comparing notes. Fines that never made sense. Rules applied unevenly. Complaints dismissed without explanation. The fence incident had opened a door, and behind it was a long hallway of unresolved grievances. The homeowner didn't need to say much. The facts spoke louder than any argument. And the more they spoke, the quieter the HOA became. Days later, the first formal acknowledgement arrived. Not an apology, nothing so direct, but an admission that the fence removal may have occurred without full procedural compliance. It was carefully worded, legalistic, and designed to minimize fault. But it was enough. Because once compliance is questioned, authority follows. The local media caught wind of the story shortly after. A reporter reached out, intrigued by the idea of an HOA bulldozing private property without notice. The homeowner hesitated briefly, then agreed to speak, on record, but measured. There was no anger in the interview. Just facts. Timelines. Documentation. The story aired quietly at first, then gained traction. Comments flooded in from viewers who had battled HOAs of their own. The narrative was no longer local. It was universal. And the HOA was watching it all unfold. Their legal counsel advised caution. Statements were delayed. Meetings were postponed. Silence returned, but this time, it wasn't powerful. It was loud. Deafening. It was the sound of an organization realizing it had underestimated both the situation and the person it tried to overpower. Meanwhile, the empty yard remained. The absence of the fence now felt intentional, like a pause before a transformation. Neighbors speculated. Some imagined a quick rebuild. Others whispered about lawsuits and settlements. The uncertainty kept everyone watching. The homeowner stayed patient. Because patience, when backed by truth, is dangerous to those who rely on control. Then, unexpectedly, a proposal surfaced. The HOA suggested mediation. A neutral discussion. A chance to move forward together. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. Cooperative. Benevolent. But beneath it was urgency. The kind that comes when options are running out. The homeowner agreed to listen. What followed would determine whether this story ended quietly, or whether it would become a precedent the HOA could never undo. As preparations were made and documents organized once more, one thing became clear: the fence was no longer the real issue. The real issue was what happens when ordinary people stop accepting unfair power and decide, instead, to challenge it. Mediation began in a room that felt deliberately neutral: blank walls, flat lighting, and an atmosphere designed to drain emotion from every word spoken inside it. Yet no amount of neutrality could erase the tension that hung in the air. What had started as a missing fence had now evolved into something far more dangerous for the HOA, a direct challenge to its authority, witnessed by an entire community. The homeowner arrived prepared, not just with documents, but with patience. Every approval, every email, every photograph was organized and ready. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of behavior that could no longer be hidden behind vague rules and selective enforcement. Across the table, the HOA's posture had changed. Gone was the confidence of unchecked power. In its place sat caution. The kind that appears when decision-makers realize their usual tactics, delay, intimidation, silence, are no longer effective. The mediator reviewed the facts slowly. The lack of notice, the existence of prior approval, the physical destruction of private property. Each point landed like a weight. There were no dramatic reactions, no raised voices. Just an uncomfortable stillness as the reality of the situation became unavoidable. The HOA's explanation was thin. They cited updated guidelines, community standards, and administrative errors. But explanations without justification carry little weight when measured against documented proof. And proof was everywhere. The homeowner didn't press aggressively. There was no need. Truth has a way of applying its own pressure. As the session progressed, it became clear that the HOA's greatest fear wasn't compensation, it was precedent. If they admitted fault publicly, if they were forced to reverse their actions, it would embolden others. Complaints would follow. Challenges would multiply. Control would fracture. So they offered compromises. First came the suggestion of a partial rebuild. Then reimbursement for materials. Then an offer to install a replacement fence under current HOA standards. Each proposal was carefully framed as a good faith effort. But none addressed the core issue: the HOA had acted without authority. The homeowner declined each offer calmly. Because rebuilding the same fence wasn't enough. What was broken wasn't just wood, it was trust. Weeks passed after mediation with no resolution. The silence from the HOA returned, but it felt different now. Desperate. Legal counsel exchanged letters. The cost of defense mounted quietly. Every delay drained resources. Every unanswered question added risk. And then, something unexpected happened. The HOA's insurance provider became involved. Once insurers reviewed the documentation, the unauthorized demolition, the lack of notice, the potential liability, the tone shifted overnight. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. It was a financial risk. One that could spiral quickly if allowed to reach a courtroom. Pressure began coming from inside the HOA itself. Board members questioned decisions that had once gone unchallenged. Meetings grew tense. Votes became divided. Resignations were whispered about, though never confirmed. The homeowner noticed the change not through announcements, but through behavior. Emails became more respectful. Language softened. Demands disappeared entirely. Then came the proposal that changed everything. The HOA offered to rebuild the fence, not as it was, but stronger. Permanent. In stone. At first, it sounded unreal. A stone fence meant cost. Significant cost. More than wood. More than vinyl. It was an admission without words. A way to resolve the issue without saying the one thing they couldn't bring themselves to say out loud. The offer came with conditions. Confidentiality. No admission of wrongdoing. No further claims. A clean ending. The homeowner didn't respond immediately. Because acceptance wasn't simple. A stone fence would stand for decades. It would be visible. Unmovable. A constant reminder of what had happened. And that visibility could change the neighborhood forever. Neighbors began to sense something was coming. Rumors circulated. People watched the empty boundary with renewed interest. The story had reached a turning point, and everyone could feel it. The homeowner walked the property line again, imagining stone rising from the ground where destruction once stood. Imagining permanence replacing vulnerability. Imagining the HOA forced to pay for something they could never erase. But the decision wasn't just about compensation. It was about meaning. Accepting the offer would end the fight. Rejecting it could extend the battle into court, exposing everything but at a personal cost. Time, energy, peace. As night fell, the homeowner stood quietly in the yard, aware that whatever came next would shape not just the property, but the power dynamics of the entire community. The choice was close now. Unavoidable. And as dawn approached, one question remained unanswered. Would the homeowner accept a silent victory, or push for a public reckoning that could change everything? The decision, when it finally came, was not driven by anger or pride, but by clarity. The homeowner understood something the HOA never fully grasped. True accountability doesn't always require a courtroom. Sometimes, it requires a reminder so permanent that it speaks without words. The offer was accepted. Not quietly, and not carelessly. The terms were reviewed in detail, every clause examined, every condition weighed. Confidentiality remained in place, but it was carefully limited. The homeowner ensured the right to speak truthfully about personal experience was preserved. The HOA would rebuild the fence in stone, covering all costs, permits, labor, and long-term maintenance related to the structure. Once the agreement was finalized, the change was immediate. Surveyors appeared first, measuring the property line with precision. Then came the marking flags, bright against the soil. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch. Some stood on sidewalks pretending not to stare. Others made no effort to hide their curiosity. The empty boundary that had become so familiar was finally about to change. The HOA never made an announcement. There was no community email, no explanation offered. But silence couldn't hide the activity. Heavy equipment returned, this time not to destroy, but to build. And the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. The first stones were laid with methodical care. Deep foundations were dug, far deeper than what a simple fence required. This wasn't something that could be undone easily. This wasn't temporary. Each block placed felt like a quiet acknowledgement of a mistake that could no longer be denied. As days turned into weeks, the wall rose steadily. The homeowner watched from a distance, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and reflection. There was no triumph in the traditional sense. No cheers. No applause. Just a steady, grounding sense of closure forming with every layer of stone. The neighborhood's mood shifted. People talked more openly now. HOA meetings became better attended. Questions were asked that would have once been dismissed. The board's authority, while still intact, felt thinner, less absolute. The wall had changed more than the landscape. It had changed expectations. Board members avoided eye contact when passing by the property. Some resigned quietly months later, citing personal reasons. New members joined with promises of transparency and fairness. Whether those promises would last was uncertain, but the message had been delivered. The stone wall neared completion. Tall, solid, unyielding. It didn't just mark a boundary, it commanded respect. It was impossible to miss, impossible to ignore. Visitors asked about it. New residents noticed it immediately. And every time the story was told, it was told calmly, factually, without exaggeration. The truth was dramatic enough on its own. The HOA had paid more than money. They had paid with credibility. Yet even as the final stones were set, there was a lingering sense that the story wasn't fully finished. Something still hung in the air. An unresolved tension. Not between the homeowner and the HOA, but within the HOA itself. Because stone lasts. And long after board members change and emails are forgotten, that wall would remain. A silent record of what happens when authority goes unchecked, and what happens when someone decides not to accept it. On the final day of construction, as the crew packed up and the dust settled for the last time, the homeowner walked the length of the wall slowly. Fingers brushed against the cool surface. Solid. Real. Permanent. But closure doesn't always arrive with the end of conflict. Sometimes it comes with reflection. The homeowner knew this story would outlive the moment. That it would be shared, retold, learned from. And somewhere down the line, someone else facing quiet injustice might remember it, and choose not to stay silent. As evening fell, the yard felt whole again. More than whole. It felt protected in a way it never had before. Yet just as peace seemed complete, a final realization surfaced. This wall, meant to end a dispute, had started something much larger. Because the HOA now faced a future where residents were watching more closely than ever before. And the true consequences of that awareness had yet to unfold. Time has a way of revealing the true impact of moments that once felt isolated. Months passed after the stone wall was completed, and with each passing season, its presence became more than a physical structure. It became a reference point, a marker in the shared memory of the neighborhood. People no longer spoke about it as that fence, but as the wall, a distinction that carried weight without explanation. Life, on the surface, returned to normal. Lawns were mowed. Cars came and went. HOA newsletters resumed their routine tone. But beneath that calm, something fundamental had shifted. Residents were no longer passive observers. They read the fine print now. They attended meetings. They asked questions. The silence that once protected unchecked decisions had been replaced by attention. The HOA adapted, not by choice, but by necessity. New procedures were introduced quietly: written notices, longer response windows, clearer approval records. Nothing in the official language admitted fault, yet every change reflected it. The organization that once relied on authority now leaned on process. Control had been replaced with caution. The homeowner felt it too. Interactions with the HOA became formal, respectful, distant. There were no more vague warnings. No sudden demands. Every communication arrived documented and measured, as if someone somewhere was always imagining how it might look if questioned. The stone wall stood through it all. Rain darkened its surface. Sunlight warmed it. Winter chilled it. And still it held firm, unmoved by the elements, just as the homeowner had remained unmoved when pressure mounted. It was no longer about victory. It was about balance, between power and accountability, between rules and rights. New neighbors moved in over time. They asked about the wall, curious but unaware of its history. The story was shared simply, without drama. A fence removed without permission. Proof uncovered. A system challenged. A boundary rebuilt in stone. No embellishment was needed. The facts carried their own gravity. And every time the story was told, it carried the same quiet lesson: authority only works when it respects those it governs. The HOA never repeated its mistake. There were disagreements, of course. Rules still existed. Fines were still issued. But there was a difference now. Transparency. Explanation. The understanding that any action could be questioned, and would be. The homeowner never sought that influence. It arrived as a byproduct of refusing to accept something wrong. On a quiet evening, standing in the yard once more, the homeowner reflected on how easily the outcome could have been different. How simple it would have been to stay silent, to accept loss, to rebuild quietly and move on. That choice would have erased the fence, and the lesson, with equal speed. But stone doesn't disappear easily. The wall had become a reminder not just for the HOA, but for everyone who saw it. A reminder that rights don't vanish because they're ignored. That rules must be enforced fairly, or not at all. And that even the most ordinary person can change the course of a system by choosing to stand still when pushed. As night settled and the neighborhood lights flickered on, the wall cast long shadows across the yard. Shadows that didn't feel threatening, but protective. Grounded. Earned. The story ended not with celebration, but with quiet resolve. Because in the end, the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger or noise, it's permanence. And long after emails fade, boards change, and memories soften, one thing will remain: a stone wall that still stands, exactly where it belongs.